Hey everybody, welcome to NaNoWriMo Week 4. I'm here with Emily Vanderbent and Riley Vore, two amazing authors. How are you doing?
Oh, just great.
Yeah, doing well.
It's great to hear. Basically, if you haven't been introduced to us yet, we're all author coaches. We're all authors. Emily's the author of the Crimson Time series, and Riley Vore is the author of All My Love from the Trenches and its upcoming sequel. And today we're going to be talking about NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, but also nonfiction books are included in this series as well. Some special considerations that might apply to you if you're an author in a unique situation that's maybe not so unique because we're talking about it today. It's just not talked about as much as you'd like it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but we'll just get right into it so it starts making sense. Uh, sort of the first thing that came to my mind in terms of a special consideration to have that I had always wanted to hear somebody talk about and just hadn't heard anybody talk about was if you have characters or the subject of your book, if it's a nonfiction book, that are totally unrelatable. They're awful people. They're just in a certain place that you can't get to or you don't really want to. And they have major flaws. How do you empathize with that character and put out a book? The first thing I would say to you is, why are you writing this book in the first place? I'm not saying don't write this book. I'm asking you to dig deep. What appeals to you about this story? Why are you wanting to write a book with evil people, evil characters, or less relatable, dial wherever it lies on the dial, so to speak? And from my experience, I didn't quite tap into the fact that, oh my gosh, my protagonists, my characters are not great people. Like just pretty much across the board, everybody in my book, from my experience, was not a good person or was doing things that were pretty horrible and had a pretty horrible worldview that I didn't want to, tap into myself. But how did I, go about and relate to these people? I kind of had to tap into that aspect. I had to look at each person and say, okay, how is this worldview something that I see myself falling into? Where did they come about to get to that place? And it's sort of a very simple answer, but I think it all starts with empathizing with the fact that there's a reason you wanted to write this story or you wanted to talk about this subject that has to do with this person. And it's not just because they're vile and it's fascinating. There's an aspect of you as a person, as a writer, that can relate to that figure in the anecdotes of your nonfiction book or that character in your fiction book. There's an aspect of you that can relate to that and that can work with that. And really tapping into that and knowing how far you need to go to understand that to be able to write your story well is really important. Now, I know both of you, while I've had some exposure to both your books, and I know not all your characters across the board are as villainous or twisted as mine. You do have aspects, everybody has aspects of their personalities that are flaws or that are things that we don't want to aspire to ourselves. How did you guys go about, delving into that with your own books?
You want to start?
Sure. Um, I think for me, I always have to kind of go back to the fact that, like, in order for a character to feel real, like, they have to have flaws, obviously. But, like, on the flip side of that, they also have to have, like, elements that sort of, like, ground them in their humanity. Or if, like, the character is not a human, still, like, ground them in, like, whatever they are. That essence, whether they're, like, a vampire or a fairy or whatever that looks like. But like as you're writing, you should have sort of like a mixed bag of emotions with every character that you're writing. Um, I think that means like you did something right. um, you have to sort of like bring them to the point where they're either like overcoming that or they're like succumbing to it. Um, and like make sure that it feels rounded in that essence. Because if you don't have the flaws coupled with like those elements of humanity, that's what people connect with.
Mm.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. I mean, what makes characters human is that they are flawed because no one wants to read a book about perfect people who do the right thing all the time. That would be a very boring book. There would be limited conflict in that scenario. So yeah, I mean, I think the flaws make it interesting, but it is hard to empathize sometimes with characters where they're making decisions that you don't feel like you yourself would make given the same scenario. But I think you have to, at least for me, when I was, writing characters that I really struggled with liking, because I have a few of those. I think I had to put myself into like how they got there, because you're working with the assumption that they were probably not born that way. So I think I really tried to give them a little bit of a backstory, maybe not to excuse how they act, but to lead me to understand why they act the way they do. Which I think gave them a good amount of reality to just kind of be like, how did they get to this point where this is how they act and this is how they see the world and this is how they respond to these situations? I think that adds a level of humanness.
I think there's something interesting here too, because we all have elements of history in our books, or ranging from historical fiction to historical fantasy. And my book in particular deals with real figures and real people. And the way I was able to characterize them was based off their actions and what they had supposedly done in real life. And judging these people by their actions, they were not great people. And peeling back from that, I had to then, like you were talking about, Emily, in terms of making them more well-rounded, I had to say, okay, how can I give them things that are fun and good without condoning the things that are bad? Where's the line in terms of, can I give them a quip or a one-liner or something fun or fun way that they interact? Can you want to root for them in this one moment, in this one chapter? And I think there's a beauty to that in doing that and not pushing it too far, but pushing it a little bit, because people are on board for that. You look across books, films, any kind of stuff, realistically, people kind of like that. I don't like that I'm rooting for this person, but I sure understand why. Or maybe they're just not rooting for them, but there's just an intriguing, sort of conflict going on there. And especially I have to imagine in real life, in real life figures and in even nonfiction books, that's what makes a good biography. That's what makes a good anecdote with these, business figures interplaying. You look at, a book like Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson, and that book's fascinating, not just because Steve Jobs, did all these great things for the company. It's because he's very three-dimensional and high highs and low lows, all involved. But that's what makes it great. And this sort of kind of leads a little bit into a comment we just got in the comments from Kyra, our fellow author Kyra Dawkins. How do you guys navigate particularly emotionally charged moments in your book? Did you find yourself needing to take breaks from your characters' thoughts or actions? Now, this goes beyond just emotionally charged in terms of, our character's doing something terrible. It could be emotionally charged in any sort of way. And I do think there's a lot of energy that gets expended. I'm curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are first. I guess I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of probably depends on what the emotion is that the moment is charged with. That depends if I need to take breaks. Like when I was writing a lot of the war sequencing in the first book, obviously I was researching a lot because I wanted to get it right. But it was also very emotional to put yourself in the scenario of all these men who are like, well, I could die in like 5 minutes. There's definitely that heightened life or death scenario that was kind of draining writing the first book, because I wanted to do it justice. I want to do that situation justice. But yeah, like emotionally it was exhausting sometimes to go through that scenario of that reality where they're all trying to be like, uplifting together while they're waiting on something to happen, but with this little like looming reality that, it could be their last day. So yeah, those were probably the moments that I needed to take breaks for the most, that were the most emotionally charged.
Yeah. For me, I'm sort of similar with this series, especially. I've had a lot of emotionally charged moments. That like when you're honestly the ones that like you're reading them on the page might not necessarily be the ones that like stand out to you in that way, but for me they're very emotionally charged, because with this series there is a lot of me in Adelaide. There's a lot of me in the things that she's sort of struggling through and the answers that she's searching for. So it can be hard sometimes to sort of like separate myself from like the character or the situation that I'm writing. And sort of on the flip side of that too, sometimes I put too much of myself into her and don't let her sort of breathe and like be her own being. But when I feel like I'm getting to that point, or I feel like there's just like too much going on, I'm like emotionally drained. This was like a real everyone I think kind of feels and knows their own threshold for that. So when I hit that, I definitely know. And that's sort of the moment that I need to like step away and do something for me. So sometimes it's just like unplugging and like reading a book or like pulling out my journal and actually like constructively passing through like the emotions or the thoughts that I'm feeling, like for me, not for an audience. So like in my own journal versus processing them on the screen. So yeah, I think everyone will find sort of their own threshold for that. And you kind of just have to give yourself the grace to step away and then find healthy ways to sort of process that, instead of like purely through the pages.
Yeah, I'm hearing what you guys say, and I'm thinking there are emotionally charged moments that are just small interactions between people that, you know, you're infusing yourself into in terms of dialogue. And it's like, oh, this was a moment in my life that was a weird interaction that, you know, made me feel a certain way when I was talking to somebody, and maybe I'm infusing it into this moment in the book, even if it's subconsciously. But then there's the other ones that stand out, you know, even more so in my head, like you're saying, Riley, in terms of just violence. You know, like early on in my book, there's a massacre, and I rewrote and banged my head a bunch of times trying to figure out how to write about it. You're going back to, am I condoning it by showing it? And it doesn't feel good. Like none of this feels good. It's necessary. It's part of what is happening, and I need to talk about it. And I ultimately decided upon, okay, I'm going to tap into the emotion and the destruction of this, but I'm not going to show it. I'm going to open this chapter in the aftermath of the massacre. And what are they doing to, quote unquote, clean up as, you know, terrible people? And I think that was a way I could just look at kind of the vileness of it and tap into that side of it without, you know, really, you know, going into darker places or going into more emotionally charged places. And it's not always that dark in terms of emotionally charged moments, right? There's other moments, but that's one that stands out to me for sure. And I definitely had to take a break after writing that chapter. I peeled back. I recovered a little bit because that took me a little too far in. I need to peel back. And something I'm thinking about that we probably can't relate to as people who haven't written memoirs yet. I have to imagine this is really tough for people who are writing memoirs, because especially if you've gone through trauma in your life or your book has to do with that kind of stuff and really tapping into those moments, not only is it probably hard to write about them, but it's also probably really hard to put yourself in the shoes of the audience and go, how much detail do I need to give? Where do I need to focus on my life to tell this story? And I have to imagine that's so bewildering and confusing, because it's already hard enough to separate ourselves from, you know, a distance piece of fiction or, you know, somewhat distance work. I can't imagine what it'd be like in a memoir. Yeah. Do you guys have any thoughts on that in particular?
I feel like it takes a very brave person to write a memoir. Just because, like, words. I feel like it takes a very intentional person to write a memoir. Because, you know, you are tapping into all these moments of your life that like you deem significant, which is not a small feat. And I feel like that's very intentional. I feel like it takes very, very intentional people to do that and say, this was important for me, and I think it's going to be important for somebody else. I think that's a very selfless act to share part of yourself very personally. So yeah, I can't imagine how that would feel. Yeah, I feel like the breaks would be abundantly more frequent writing a memoir, just to kind of, because you're not, because you're like reliving your own experience, whatever it may be, whether it's, you know, traumatic or just something that, hurt your heart, or, something completely different. Like, you're reliving your moments. And yeah, I feel like that would be very just jarring emotionally.
Yeah, what a great question from Kyra, and I think you can kind of take it in a lot of different places, but that's definitely one that's very fascinating, and it'd be interesting to talk to more people who have written memoirs about that. Sort of kind of pivoting to a little more of the technical side of some special considerations. So complete pivot, no transition whatsoever. You both are writing series, and that's unique. That is a very different process from just writing one book at a time across, different focuses, different genres, let's say. What's it like? I'm not writing a series. What is it like? What are the special considerations and focuses for somebody who's going into book 2, or you're writing book 1 and maybe that you're going to have book 2, book 3 later on? What would be your advice?
Well, I'll let Emily start, because she knew she was writing a series. I had no idea. So I'll let Emily start, and then I'll pick up.
Yeah. It's interesting, Vincent. It's interesting. I'll start with that. I don't know, like, as far as the journey goes, like, no two books are ever alike. No two, like, writing journeys are ever alike. I approached book 1 a lot different than I approached book 2 than I approached book 3, because you learn more about your characters and more about the world and more about the story sort of as you're going, and like building on top of each other. Every book is like its own beast and has its own set of obstacles that you sort of have to battle through to, like, get that draft finished, get those edits finished, and get to the other side of actually publishing it. I'm sort of like on the 3rd book of a series right now. And for me, like, there are different challenges that have, like, come my way, and different things that I found, like, easier or harder depending on, like, what stage of the process I'm on, and, like, which book I was writing. So, like, on the 3rd one of the things that, like, for me so far I felt has sort of, like, flowed easier, is just navigating writing the relationships between the characters, because I do know them a lot better on book 3 than I knew them on book 1. I feel like how they're interacting with each other, what they're saying, what they're doing, and sort of like how they're coming across on the page in my first draft of Veiled Scars, which is like the 3rd book. That essence feels like it's coming across a lot stronger and a lot better than, like, my first draft of, like, Crimson Time or Fractured Past. But, like, sort of on the flip side of that, the story as a whole, while I know it in my head on this first draft, something in the translation between, like, my brain and my fingers is, like, tripping up a little bit. So, like, yeah,
relatable.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. But, like, a first draft regardless is going to be messy, and, like, that's okay. But just, like, knowing how the process has gone before, and maybe, like, that first book was easy. Maybe that first draft flew out of your head and it was just awesome. That doesn't mean it's going to be the same book you write in the series, or the next book that you write in a completely different genre on a completely different topic. If you're writing nonfiction, it's going to look and it's going to feel different. But as far as, like, a series goes, I think you're going to know, like, your characters a lot more. You're going to know the world and the story as a whole a lot more as you're going on. And I think just with each book that you build, like, onto your repertoire, you're, like, learning more about yourself as a writer, and, like, how you function, how you can hold yourself accountable, and sort of, like, what different things come across when people are reading your story back in terms of, like, what your voice actually sounds like, and a lot of those different technical things about, like, how you write. So you can sort of use all of those things going into all of those different drafts and those different books. But the journey itself isn't necessarily going to look the same.
Yeah, for sure. That was very eloquent. Good job. I don't know how much I can add. But yeah, I fell into series writing. I had really no intention of writing a series. I was really content with where my characters ended in All My Love from the Trenches. And I had always planned for it to be a standalone. But through the editing process, I had various editors tell me that they thought people would ask for another one. Based on a few certain characters. Emily was convinced I needed a second one. I heard many words from her. But yeah, so I kind of jumped into writing my second one. I was just like, okay, well, we'll try it and we'll see what happens. I had absolutely nothing planned. I had no idea really whose story it was going to be. So I kind of went into book 2 very blindly because I had All My Love from the Trenches really plotted and really planned out. I mean, it changed naturally, but I knew where I was going with that one. I knew the end result. I knew where that story was going to end up. And I didn't even know where the second story was starting. So I kind of fell into series writing, but Emily said it very well that each book is a different beast, both interest, the writing journey and the story in general. Like each story is going to function differently, but also your writing journey is going to be so dramatically different from book to book. Like I've said that the fear and the nerves for book 1 was very heightened, but the imposter syndrome for book 2 was off the charts. Because I feel like when you write a series, there's this expectation that you've already put out this book in the world. So now you're connecting another book to that. So you're like, okay, it has to be equally as good or it has to top it.
Yeah.
So there's kind of that pressure that you put on yourself. Yeah. So I always say that the imposter syndrome was really what changed for me in book 2. But I think it's a fun journey to get past that. Because I had many beta readers tell me, they were like, you sound so much more confident in Send My Love to London Town than you did in All My Love from the Trenches. And I was like, I do? Because could not see that at the time. Glad that came across, because that's not what I felt. So I think it's kind of just, trust your instincts and trust your story, and your characters normally take the reins for you, so just let them.
Interesting. I love thinking about what you guys are saying in terms of each book being its own and tackling it as it comes, and then interrelating that to the expectations that you set up by having a first book that's already released. And I think I already know your answer to this, basically, based on how you write, but I just wanted to clarify it for people who may be listening, in that, do you recommend, oh my gosh, I know I'm going to write a trilogy, I have it planned out, I'm going to write all 3 right now, and I'm going to finish them all, and then I'm going to release book 1? What's the take there?
I would not suggest. Only because I think it's very interesting to base a little bit, not base a lot, but to base a little bit off audience response of book by book. Because I would have never guessed in a million years that the character that Send My Love to London Town really follows would be the character people would want more of. I would have never in a million years guessed that. I thought that Nellie was going to be I thought she was going to be just a very wholesome, sweet little sister side character. I would have never in a million years guessed that people wanted more of her, but that was the primary reaction I got after book 1 had been out for a while. So I think it's always kind of interesting to get a little bit of audience response before you go into another book. Not necessarily to change your mind, but to maybe see what people react to. And I feel like if you have, your plot planned out already, you might not want to veer from that. So I feel like it's kind of interesting to let your audience lead a little bit, because they're the people that are going to be buying your book. They're the people that are going to be reading your book and hopefully loving your book. So I think it's kind of interesting to hear from them before you crank out a whole series.
Yeah, I might go.
I
Oh, go for it, Emily.
Oh no, you're good. I was just gonna say, like, I would definitely agree with that. Getting your audience feedback, but also add that like it's possible to love what you're writing, especially like if you're in the world of a series and you have a ton of these different books that you know you want to like crank out for them, but still get burnt out by the story and get burnt out by your characters and like want some sort of other creative outlet. That for me was sort of why it took me a little bit longer. I jumped pretty quickly from like Crimson Time to Fractured Past, but from Fractured Past to Veiled Scars, it took me a little bit longer to actually get to the point where I was like, okay, let's start drafting this thing. Because I love my characters, I love the world, but there were other stories and other things sort of spinning in my head, and I felt like I needed a little bit of a palate cleanser. So like give yourself that grace. Don't feel like you have to sit down and crank out the entire trilogy, or whatever it is that you planned. Obviously, if you're on a deadline and like your publisher wants like all 3 of these books next, like, stick with what they want. But if you have the leeway to sort of like play with your schedule a little bit and work on what you want to work on, you might need to sort of redirect your attention to the thing that's calling your attention, get a couple chapters of that done, and then go back to like what you actually should be working on.
I'm hearing a lot of the same advice and kind of thoughts that we had about outlining and improvisation within an outline just of one book, but on a larger scale. And I think there's sort of a natural rejuvenation in the process that you're putting out one book at a time. And yes, it's a lot of work to put that out, and it lengthens the timeline that you're releasing whatever planned series, whether it's planned or not, it's, lengthening the amount of time, but it's also building in new energy. Sort of, yes, you're working, you're pushing it out there, but it's a break from the actual writing part. And it's a chance to kind of breathe from that and then come into the next book with something new. And that's going to improve it. That's going to improve your series. It's going to give you new ideas. And I think something kind of dialing it back to a smaller scale, there's a lot of, different resources like Wattpad, Kindle Vella, all these other things where serialized writing content has become a very prominent way for people to get their books published and to first write their first draft in a serialized form and then release the book later. Now, is there still a drafting phase after that happens when you've incorporated feedback as you've gone? None of us have done this, but this is something I'm curious. Do you think that for authors who are writing a book serialized first, incorporating that content incorporating that feedback as they go, do you think there's still a whole separate drafting phase on the end of that? Or does there need to be?
I don't know if there's a separate drafting phase. I feel like there'd probably be a pretty heavy like revision phase, but I don't necessarily feel like they would need to like redraft. But I mean, kind of taking feedback, and obviously like they could change stuff, but that feels more like a revision phase than anything, kind of just altering what they already have. But I mean, I feel like you would want to probably look at it all together, like after you had put out various aspects every so often. I feel like you would kind of want to look at it all together and be like, does it still make sense altogether? Is there something I want to change? I feel like that's kind of a natural progression once you have it all completed.
Tying that back, so that's interesting because you're answering in that way with this, but tying it back to like the larger scale, that's the same thought, right? You're not necessarily recreating the plan for your series if you have one, but you're incorporating these feedback as they come, these new ideas as they come. And it's not necessarily a new drafting phase. It's just a more intense revisions process. Emily, were you going to add something too as well? Oh, I think Emily might have cut out for a sec. Oh, great. Okay. Well, actually,
sorry, can you repeat that? My internet keeps kind of like fluctuating.
No worries at all. I was just going to follow this up. We heard from Kyra again. She's working on a set of companion works instead of a sequel. I also think that's a fascinating concept. And I have to imagine there's a lot of the same considerations following up on different threads. And then there's another follow-up question from Kyra. How obligated do you feel to give the readers what they want with your sequels? This is interesting. Expectations, tonal consistencies, but new enough that it's not the same. Why didn't you just make this one book if it's just going to be the same as the other one? Oh, this doesn't feel like the same series. Oh, this one's not as good. All these things that people might bring up. What are your guys' thoughts? Emily, what's your thought on this? Or Riley, if you want to take it first while Emily's buffering back in.
I don't necessarily know if I feel obligated to give readers what they want. I feel like I always want to know.
Yeah. I think you need to match. Oh, I'm buffering again.
Oh yeah, just a bit. No, go for it. Go for it.
Go for it.
Oh no, we're losing her.
Oh no, Emily, come back. Yes, no, maybe so.
Well.
Am I still buffering?
Yeah, no, you're buffering in and out, but now you're here.
Good.
No.
It's okay. Go for it.
Go for it. Let's hear it.
Oh no.
Never mind, Riley. Let's hear your take.
All right. Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily feel obligated. I feel like I always want to know what it is the readers want, but I feel like, you don't always have to do that. I mean, yeah. Like, I'm trying to think of a way to say this without spoiling anything about my own book. But I guess I'll put it in the context of All My Love from the Trenches, because there were definitely aspects that I knew just through conversing with my beta readers or just people that I was throwing ideas around with, that there were things they wanted to see happen in All My Love from the Trenches that did not happen, or vice versa. So I feel like I always want to know what the readers want, but I don't necessarily always feel obligated to give it to them, because I don't know. I feel like that kind of goes at the end of the day. It's your book, and it's your gut instinct, and it's your characters. So you can do what you want with them. So, oh, you're back.
Yay.
I'm back.
Yay. I was supposed to answer, so you can go ahead and answer now.
We've got a storm going through.
Oh, bummer. Real quick from Kyra, she had a thought on a follow-up for this. Your readers could be asking for something that they are asking for because they don't know the story as well as you do.
Big facts.
You're the architect. You have all the knowledge in comparison. Maybe there's something they need, but they think they want something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Emily knows my story. She's read my newest book in its entirety, and I think she can probably reasonably agree with me that there's something that very much relates to this question. And I don't know if people will be disappointed or happy, but we'll see.
Emily, something I'm interested in with regards to something you're working on in particular is how all these different expectations in a drafting process relates to your new book is in a different genre than your other book. It's not the same series. You're just an author writing a different book, and it's divergent from what you're working on previously, whether it be a series or no. How do you find a new voice as an author writing in a new genre or for a new series or a different take? How do you avoid, conversely, staying tethered to, not conversely. How do you avoid staying tethered to that old voice, but how do you conversely also keep tonal consistencies and your authorial voice branching out into new genres, basically?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I think that voice is sort of one of those things that like subconsciously works itself into what you're writing. At least that's like sort of how I've experienced it. I don't necessarily like set out to like have a certain voice or like match my voice between projects or between like books in the same series. But there's always sort of some sort of thread that like ties them all together. For me, I know that like my voice usually contains like a lot of like detailed and colorful like descriptions. That's like a staple of my voice because that's one of the things that I really love to write. Usually there's like some sort of element of like a strong female character, strong female characters, strong complex female characters. And then usually some sort of like historical element or like tie into the past, or like remembrance. But like I didn't necessarily like purposefully do those things. And I don't necessarily purposefully do those things in all the different things that I write. Crimson Time, obviously, like that sort of carries over.
Yeah.
It is a series and it has to.
Yeah.
I do have to like match my voice in that, in like what I've established in book one does sort of have to continue as a thread through the others. But I don't think it's necessarily something that you need to know going into it. And I especially don't think on like that very first thing that you write that you're going to go to publish, you probably won't necessarily know what your voice sounds like at that point unless you've written a lot beforehand. More often than not, you see it kind of in hindsight. And those are usually things too that like your readers or beta readers or other authors will like point out to you. Like if you read like 5 different like Charles Dickens books, like
Yeah.
you didn't have his name or the title and you just read it, like you would be able to feel it's like a feeling. You're able to feel that they're the same.
Yeah.
A Stephen King book, you know when you're reading like a Stephen King book. But again, like I wouldn't say it's something that you like should be super focused on, especially that first draft. If anything, it's something you'll sort of come to see as you write more things, because you need several works to sort of be able to start seeing what that pattern looks like.
I think I completely agree with you that if you hyper focus on it, you're blocking what the story, whatever you're tackling at that moment needs naturally. That should be first priority. And then focus on, consistencies and expectations and management of how does this tie into me as a larger author. Book first, author second. That's my take on it. And I think that's coming from somebody who hasn't written a series. I just have one book out and now I'm working on screenplays, but eventually book 2, I'm looking at doing a completely different genre. And so I'm starting to toy around with, okay, how do I want to develop the look of this, the feel of this? What's going to be different from book 1, a different book that I did, and what's going to be the same? And I think if I keep focusing on just what's my voice going to be like, more so than what does the story need to be told in the right way to get across to people, I think I'm going to be missing the mark a little bit. And I think that you read authors with different voices, like you said, like you read Dickens or you read Tolstoy is one that comes to mind. You read early Tolstoy and you can feel it's early. It's not as polished. And then you can feel late and it's like, oh, that's polished. And then there's like late. It's like, oh, this is getting like, you're getting older. This is getting like a little too far into some certain direction. And I just think these things are interesting and you follow them through their books and through their works, through their body of works. And I think that's something that's very impressive to build out that not every author is able to do. Not every author is able to keep enough interest for people to look at them in that way instead of just one book. So I think hyper focusing on it as something that you think you can control is misleading to yourself because it's not necessarily something that's in your hands entirely. Each book is a gift that you're able to put it out there, that you're able to write it. So really focus on making that book the best it can be first and foremost. That would be my take on voice consistency, which is, that's kind of a little off topic, but that's how I think about it. Yeah. Riley, do you have any follow-ups on this?
Yeah, I think, I feel like voice is never something that I actively think about. I feel like it's kind of something that just emerges as you write. I was giving Emily weird looks because I was waiting on the I write lots of descriptions. I was like, there's not a thread, there's not something that flows. Okay, interesting. No, but I feel like it's kind of your voice naturally. So I feel like hyperfixation on it is not super necessary. Like I can't stand lengthy descriptions. So I like the short, punchy, I call them my Hemingway sentences.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I mean, so I feel like that's, it's something that's yours and it's gonna be a preference. And you're probably gonna write how you like to read. And I feel like, the more you read, your voice might change a little bit, but it's still gonna be yours, and there's still gonna be, footprints of you in it. So I don't necessarily think it's something that you need to fixate on.
You made me think of a funny anecdote because I wrote my book over the course of 7 years, and I was, a teenager while I was writing it, and I was like a vocal sponge, so to speak, in terms of author voices. So I'd read a Dickens book. I read Tell Two Cities, and I really liked it. And whatever chapters I was working on at that moment started sounding way too much like Dickens. And then I'd get to the next book I'd be reading, and it's more, just like very much so some modern book with a completely different writing style. And it just didn't flow. And because I was focusing on voice, I'm like, ooh, I really like that.
Yeah.
Let me repeat that. Let me, take that in instead of focusing on the book. And I think that's interesting because I've learned sort of the hard way how that can change what you're doing for maybe not the best. But then there's the flip side of it where it is still something that's important and it is something to be aware of, if not fixated on. Final thoughts from you guys in terms of any other special considerations that come to mind for people who are tackling NaNoWriMo. They've got the basics down of outlining and working on whether it be a fiction or nonfiction book, but there's just another element that might change how you do things. You have any other thoughts on that?
Jump in there.
I'll say this just because it's sort of the first thing that came to mind, so why not? But I think like one of the big things that comes up during NaNoWriMo is like burnout, because you're so fixated on getting those 50,000 words down. And like naturally, because it's fun, it's the competition, and like obviously you want to hit that mark. But like give yourself a grace for it, and also like give yourself, even outside of NaNoWriMo, give yourself like mini rewards. Like mini rewards are so satisfying to like the writing process and like spurring you on to that next chapter, that next 10,000 words, that next like round of revisions, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be anything massive. It could be like, hey, I'm gonna go get a coffee like sometime this week when I hit X amount of words.
Yeah.
Or I'm gonna go buy myself a new book when I finish this round of revisions. Just like little things to like keep you inspired and like motivated along the way. Because I know at different points life gets crazy, things are going on, you get burnt out or stressed, and sometimes it's nice to have sort of like those little things. Obviously, you're working toward the big thing of like finally having a book in your hand, but having like little things you can work to like throughout the process too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. The first thing I thought of was like, don't be afraid of literally everything you plan changing.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I had a very distinct vision for both books, and they both ended up somewhere different. So, use your plan, make a plan, write your words. But if they're different words than you planned, that's okay.
Yes, make a plan with all your heart and then be willing at a dime to abandon it if need be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you both for talking with me. Thank you, Kyra, in the comments for giving us some very good topics of discussion. And thank you, everybody, for watching, whether it's now or later. Basically, this is getting close to the end of the NaNoWriMo streams. Next week, we have a topic of wrapping up NaNoWriMo. Wrapping up your draft, basically, is what we're talking about. How do you finish that draft? How do you move on to the next stages? And our final week, we'll be talking about how do you start the editing process, depending on whether you're self-publishing, wherever you might be in terms of what you plan to do with your book. How do you go about starting the editing process and moving away from drafting? So very excited to talk about those things. I think they're very important. And if we think of more special considerations along the way, or if you have any, please feel free to comment. Feel free to message us, email us at any of the places below. Our Instagram is @manuscripts.ed. It's another great place to reach us. Connect with us, talk with us. We'd love to answer questions on these streams. We'd love to make new streams to answer questions. We love talking about books. I could talk all day, just about anything, but books in particular and writing, I'd love to talk about it. So thanks for watching. Please come back whenever. And yeah, I'll just end it there. Have a good one, you guys.
Good night.
Okay.